Imagine waking up to a world that has been rewritten overnight. Every glacier, every ice sheet, every frozen peak is gone. The familiar coastlines have vanished under an endless rising sea. Cities that once hugged the shorelines now stare at water, where streets used to be. Humans step outside and realize everything they built sits in a different geography. This is the thought experiment we will explore. What if all ice on Earth melted overnight? Short, shocking, and impossible in reality, but useful to reveal hidden truths. Listen closely because the implications ripple through every corner of life. This scenario forces us to think beyond immediate headlines. Antarctica stores the vast majority of Earth's ice, a frozen continent thicker than many countries are wide. Greenland holds a massive reserve that, if released, would lift seas by dozens of meters. Thousands of mountain glaciers, the cryosphere in tundra and highlands, act like nature's reservoirs. Together, they keep the world's climate functioning in ways most people never notice. If all of it melted, global sea levels would rise by about 60 to 70 meters, roughly 200 to 230 feet. To picture that, imagine water covering entire megacities and swallowing islands whole. The suddenness would magnify impacts we usually imagine unfolding slowly. Within hours, coastal neighborhoods would vanish and ports would drown. Communities living near the shorelines would wake up displaced and desperate. Refugee flows would be measured not in millions but in the billions as people flee submerged lands. Transportation networks would falter as highways flood and airports are lost to the sea. Economic systems built around coastal trade hubs would grind to a halt. Global supply chains would fracture, creating immediate scarcity of essential goods. Humanitarian agencies would struggle to scale a response this large. But the crisis would not stop at floodlines. Ice plays a critical role in Earth's climate because it reflects sunlight back into space. Without that reflective shield, the planet would absorb more solar radiation and warm faster. This albedo effect amplifies heating and pushes weather systems into new, unstable patterns. Heat-loving pests would expand their ranges, tropical storms could grow stronger and wetter, and deserts might spread. Ecosystems and economies would both be pushed into unfamiliar territory. Freshwater systems would be profoundly affected. Many rivers rely on seasonal glacier melt to maintain flow. Without glaciers, waters would recede after initial floods and leave communities thirsty. Agriculture that depends on predictable meltwater would suffer devastating failures. Food production in major breadbaskets could collapse, increasing the risk of famine across continents. The oceans themselves would change in chemistry and circulation. Marine ecosystems would shift rapidly. Coral reefs could bleach and major fisheries might collapse, leaving coastal communities without vital food sources. Meltwater dilutes seawater, disrupting density-driven currents like the Atlantic Meridional, overturning circulation. Such a collapse could cool some regions even as global averages rise, creating sharp regional contrasts in temperature and weather. People who rely on the sea for protein and livelihoods would be left without vital resources. Cultural heritage would suffer irreparable loss. Coastal archaeological sites, ancient port cities, and cultural landscapes dating back millennia would be submerged. Places that anchor community identities, the waterfront markets, the old harbors, the family shrines, would disappear. Loss of place is also loss of memory, and the human story itself would be partially erased. Governance systems would face their sternest test. Mass displacement invites political instability as populations surge into inland regions. Border disputes could ignite when nations guard scarce highlands and fertile valleys. Some states would gain territory simply by possessing higher ground and fresh water, while others would cease to exist on maps. International law would strain under new claims, property rights, and migration pressures. The economic shock would be staggering. Ports, shipping hubs, and global trade routes would vanish. Trillions in infrastructure would be lost and markets would collapse. Financial systems would face unprecedented liabilities as insurance, banking, and credit markets buckle under the shock. Global poverty could spike dramatically as jobs vanish and governments struggle to respond. Infrastructure designed for a stable coastline, sewers, power plants, desalination plants, would be badly mismatched to the new reality. And yet, The most haunting part of this nightmare is personal. Families losing homes and hours would pack what they can and step into an uncertain future. Children would watch schools flood and learn that places their parents knew no longer exist. Entire generations uprooted with nowhere to return would face loss beyond material things. Psychological burdens of grief and instability would balloon, straining public health systems already under pressure. Ecosystems beyond the sea would buckle under new stressors. Species bound to seasonal ice, polar bears, certain seals, and many Arctic birds, would face extinction or severe population collapses. Plant ranges would shift poleward or upward in elevation, but not every species can move quickly enough. Extinction cascades would ripple through food webs, altering ecosystem services like pollination and water purification that humans rely on. Technological responses would arise quickly but imperfectly. Some engineers would propose vast seawalls and flood barriers, raising defenses inch by inch around submerged cities. Others would design floating habitats and modular mobile infrastructure to follow retreating coastlines. Desalination and atmospheric water capture would become lifelines for communities cut off from traditional freshwater sources. But technology requires capital and governance, and solutions would be unevenly distributed, favoring wealthy nations and corporations. Human ingenuity could also drive radical adaptation in agriculture and food systems. Vertical farms, lab-grown meats, and synthetic proteins might scale rapidly to replace lost farmland yields. Yet these solutions depend on energy, supply chains, and skilled labor, assets that may be scarce during widespread crisis. Adapting food systems would be critical, but it would not be easy or immediate for most regions. Long-term geopolitical realignments would follow. Countries with highlands, freshwater lakes, and temperate climates would become strategic anchors of new power blocks. Regions once peripheral could gain significance overnight because of elevation and water access. International cooperation would be necessary, and yet politically fraught as old rivalries and new resource pressures collide. Some would turn to radical ideas as hope and despair coexist. The most ambitious could push for space colonization, viewing Mars or orbital habitats as backup homes for humanity. Private companies and governments might accelerate plans for off-world living, but leaving Earth is logistically and ethically complex. For the vast majority, survival and rebuilding would be terrestrial tasks demanding collective action. The thought experiment forces a moral reckoning. What responsibilities do nations have to displaced peoples and to those who lose ancestral lands? How do we decide who receives protection and who does not when resources are stretched thin? Ethical dilemmas around triage, resource allocation, and prioritization of infrastructure would dominate policy debates. Justice for vulnerable communities, indigenous peoples, low-income coastal residents, and small island nations would become a test of global values. The thought experiment still stings because it strips away illusions of permanence. This thought experiment shows how tightly linked planetary systems are, affecting food, weather, and the very fabric of society. We can choose panic or we can choose purpose. History shows societies can transform under crisis when driven by shared will and clear leadership. And if we pair mitigation with equitable adaptation, the worst of these scenarios can be avoided. This is not a call to fear, but to responsibility. The ice's retreat is both mirror and warning. It demands action to protect what remains. If this thought experiment moved you, act in ways both big and small. Support climate policy, reduce waste, and lift voices of affected communities. Share knowledge and pressure leaders to prioritize long-term stability over short-term gain. And remember that science, policy, and human compassion together can mend the path we are on. If you found this exploration valuable, like and subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaping our planet, and share this video